If there is one aspect of how government works that most economists and historians largely agree on, it's that the government programs have a tendency towards being pathetically inefficient and wasteful of resources when compared to equivalent private enterprise. But why is this? Why does the government constantly fail to make good use of our money? Some of the answers to this are pretty obvious, and others are actually quite surprising. And so for this video, we're going to go over the more interesting explanations for the phenomena of the eternal government money pit, starting first with how the government often ignores risks and evidence. Let's say a private company wants to construct an office building. Because their ultimate goal is to turn a profit, the company has an incentive to make sure that the risks involved with their expenditures are reasonable. How do they do this? Simple. Base their decisions on evidence. As long as the company works with their construction crew, architects, and all others involved, make sure that the facts suggest that their path to completing the project is the most likely to succeed with the best efficiency, the private company can make sure that they aren't risking moves on pie-in-the-sky plans that would only waste their money. This way, the construction of their new office is reached in a way that is the best of their ability with minimal overhead. But what about the same project, only this time done as a government program? There's a critical difference that causes some serious problems. The government is mainly focused on the goal and not so much any concerns with profits. At first glance, some people might mistake this of being a good thing. Profits are selfish anyways. But here's the problem. The lack of focus means that the government doesn't really care so much about the risks of overspending and wastefulness, as their incentive is to simply complete the project to satisfy their political allies, not so much complete it efficiently to earn a profit. And so government programs often put significantly less focus on, or sometimes just outright ignore, evidence. Evidence. And there's a problem with the construction with the workers. Who cares? Just throw more money at the problem, and the problem will eventually go away. This is where we see the root cause of the wastefulness. Risks are a simple fact of life. Just about every living thing on Earth has to deal with risk management. The tiger takes risks with their energy when it goes for a kill. The zebra takes risks when going for a swim. It's the law of the jungle. Ignoring risks, or even undervaluing risks, is a fool's error. So while blindly throwing money at a problem often eventually works, it does so at the cost of significantly more resources than the private company that is simply cared about profit. So in a twist of irony, the supposedly selfish private project that focused on profit actually has the greater incentive to look at the evidence behind their risks, and thus ends up being less wasteful of resources and better for society as a whole. There is also a related problem that can occur with government where money is less of a consideration, known as the knowledge problem of central planning. To put it simply, it's much harder to understand the needs of a nation when you don't focus on profits and you don't focus on value. There is already a fairly good and popular video on this, fortunately, put out by the Learn Liberty channel. For those curious or who just haven't seen it yet and are interested, a link shall be in the description below. Next up on our money pit journey is corruption in Congress. Most people are aware of how Congress spends tons of money on nonsense that no one really needs. This is known as pork barrel spending, and it's almost like we've grown kinda numb to it, a financial version of Stockholm Syndrome almost. We see them spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to study effects of cocaine on the sex drive of Japanese quail. Yes, that really happened. And we all just kind of go, meh, whatever, as expected, just another day. It's easy to sit back and laugh at all the crud that government wastes our tax dollars on. This is unfortunate, because when you study the details of pork spending, you realize how we really shouldn't be getting desensitized to this nonsense. Most people make the mistake of thinking pork spending is just an example of government ineptitude, and so we all just shrug it off. Oh well, Congress is just full of clowns, I guess. But the thing is, this is actually not true. These kinds of wastes are not happening because of Congress being inept. Rather, when you dig deeper, it becomes apparent that they know exactly what they are doing. Pork spending is a calculated and intentional move. A perfect example that showcases this was when $40 million was used on upkeep for the M1 Abrams tank. Thing is, the military didn't want it, and they didn't need it, and they had no use for it. They have tons of these tanks lying around in the desert, already going to waste. So why was such spending approved? Well, to put money in the hands of people working on the tanks, because those people voted for the Congress members who introduced the pork, and thus the root cause of the problem is revealed. Congress has more of an incentive to repay favors to their lobbyists and other political donors than to make sure the money is being spent on actual good ideas. It's not that they don't know pork barrel spending is bad, it's that they don't care. They will happily spend our tax dollars on baloney that has no chance of being useful to society as long as those dollars are exchanged through the hands of their allies. Whether or not profit is being made on these, or if any useful products are coming out of it in the end, doesn't really matter. It's irrelevant to their goals. The issue of pork spending leading to the funding of useless endeavors boils down to a fundamental difference between private companies and members of Congress. In the way that private companies are supported by investors and shareholders, Congress members are supported by campaign donors and lobbyists. While lobbying isn't always bad, there's a need for free speech after all, there is an issue with how the system operates that encourages far more questionable tactics than with private enterprise. In the case of investors in private business, they generally invest because they believe that the business has a genuinely good idea. They seek to earn a portion of the profits from the product or service born from this idea that consumers are, and this word is key, willing to pay for. However, with lobbying, this isn't exactly the case. Lobbyists rather seek to earn their money in the favors returned by Congress in the form of looting tax dollars. It doesn't matter if people are willing to pay for anything produced by the pork projects this way or not, as citizens have little choice when the government decides to spend resources on nonsense nobody wants. And thus, the pork barrel spending is born, because it doesn't matter if taxpayers want the pork or are willing to use it. The point of the pork is not to be productive, but to satisfy political allies in order to stay in power, all at the taxpayer's expense, as we are forced to pay for it. Private companies, on the other hand, cannot force consumers to pay for their product, and thus have a far greater incentive to spend their money on things that are useful than the government does. Now, you might be asking yourself, how does Congress continue to justify this poor behavior? Again, in some ways they don't really care, but there is in fact a new excuse on the block, which brings us to our last method of government waste, MMT abuse. So I've saved a more complex problem for last. This is one that not quite everybody may have heard of, so I'll give a brief explanation. MMT stands for Modern Monetary Theory. The simplest way to explain MMT without rambling on for 30 minutes is to look at cryptocurrency. You know, things like Bitcoin, Litecoin, McAfee didn't kill himself coin, or even Dogecoin. Cryptocurrency is unique in that most of them are decentralized and not backed up by any physical, well, anything really, and yet they still have value, sometimes lots of value. Without going into a cryptocurrency tangent, the point is it proves that currency can have value based purely on the result of consumer and trader confidence. This is the basic foundation of MMT. Currency in the modern day doesn't necessarily need to be tied to anything physical, such as the gold standard, to have trade value. It is instead based more on confidence and trust, or at least that's what MMT claims. The US government is very powerful, and the dollar is used as a trusted trade currency all around the world. Thus, it is argued that the US government can simply print as much money as it needs without risking a Zimbabwe 2.0 situation. The problem with MMT is that while parts of it are already proven to kind of work, economists aren't exactly sure yet to what limits it can work. You ask 10 different experts on this subject, and you will get 10 different opinions. Again, the reason Zimbabwe can't get away with this, and the US can, is because international trust in the dollar. Well, let's say the US government decides to go crazy with this idea and goes full-on money printer go burr. Well, pushed to its logical conclusions, eventually other economies such as China or Russia may start to lose faith in the dollar. This would put the US in a bad position, where they would have to choose between insanely high taxation on citizens to control the inflation or risking international trade dropping the dollar, at which point MMT kind of immediately stops working. It could also place government-backed currencies in a similar situation to cryptocurrencies, where speculation in the markets can result in much more absurd spikes in trade value than most of the normies are used to seeing. So relying on MMT is basically gambling with the international trust of a currency. Is it really worth it? Unfortunately, many in Congress seem to view MMT as a good excuse to not care about the debt and just kind of go nuts with the spending. The problem with this is that even if MMT is completely true, that's not exactly a good excuse to spend money unwisely. But spending money poorly is exactly what they are doing, so the system is ripe for abuse. And since the only way to control MMT, if and when it does start to become an issue, is to tax us, it kind of brings us back to square one, where citizens are being forced to pay for pork spending. It can also result in a slow takeover of the private sector as the government spends funds more and more into the public sector. So while MMT may mean that the government can get away with it for a while, it's still not exactly a fair system and is somewhat uncharted territory. And that leads us to a straightforward conclusion. In a nutshell, the reason government programs and spending tends to be more wasteful than private spending is really because the government can get away with it. They don't have to worry about consent of the consumer, profits are a secondary goal for them at best, and these differing incentives do not require them to be as careful or intuitive. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like, subscribe, and all that good stuff.